Hi, everybody. Today we're going to start Chapter 9, which is Crimes Against the Person. And we're going to start by looking at homicide. And I'm going to break this into a couple different PowerPoints so that they're a little bit more manageable. But the first thing we're going to look at here is murder. And then in the other PowerPoint, we will look at manslaughter and other homicide crimes. Homicide is, by definition, anytime you have a killing of one human being by another human being. So the one thing that I want to point out before we go any further here, and at this point, if we were in the classroom, what I would do is draw a big umbrella on the board to show you the illustration that homicide is actually a whole category of crimes. It's an umbrella term. And then within homicide, we have the different degrees of murder. We have voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, all of the different crimes that are made up of someone killing someone else. And the reason I point that out is because in a lot of TV shows and movies and stuff, they use the terms homicide and murder interchangeably, and that is not accurate. Technically, you can have a homicide that is non-criminal, whether it be excusable or justifiable, and we're going to get into those when we have the defenses, but basically you could have like self-defense, for example. So if someone attacks you, and you defend yourself in an appropriate manner, and as a result, the person who is attacking you dies. Did you commit a homicide? Technically, yes, you did. You killed another human being. Did you commit murder? No. A court is going to find that you did not commit murder because your actions were excusable because you were exercising self-defense. So just keep that in mind, guys, as we move forward. Homicide is a category of crimes. And then in that category, we have the different types of murder. All right, so homicide, not the same as murder. Murder is a type of homicide. And in order to have murder, we have to have malice. And this is the definition of malice. And I put this here in italics because I want you guys to pay particular attention to it. All right, malice is having the intent to kill or seriously harm another person. So you might intend to seriously harm someone. You can't just say like, well, I didn't want them to die. All right. You can't say, well, I chopped someone's arm off, but I didn't think they were going to die from it. Guys, that's a serious enough crime. That is a serious enough injury that the court's going to find that in this case, yes, you were reckless enough that you should have known they were going to die from it. You display a lack of regard for human life, okay? And there are different degrees of murder, and that's what we're going to talk about here. As I go through these, what we're going to actually look at are the rules that apply in Pennsylvania. And every state has its own statutes for the different degrees of murder, and they might have different names. What constitutes murder in the second degree in Pennsylvania might not be the same as murder in the second degree in another state. And sometimes they're a little bit different from state to state. Murder is not a federal crime, and a lot of students think that federal crimes are way worse than state crimes. If you commit a federal crime, it is way worse than a state crime, and that's not necessarily true. You could murder someone, and you could go to trial, and you could be found guilty and subject to capital punishment, which is the death penalty, and that could all be done within a state. So we're going to look at Pennsylvania just because that's where we are, and that is what is most applicable. But if any of you go on to law school in a different state, you might find that what you learn in terms of the elements and the specific crimes are actually a little bit different. Okay, so we're going to start with first-degree murder, and first-degree murder tends to be the easiest one to establish, and these are the elements. The intentional killing of another human being. It has to be premeditated, so you have to think about it ahead of time. It has to be deliberate, so you have to do it on purpose. And it has to be done with malice, which we just defined on the last slide. And then again, guys, the intent can be to kill someone or to cause severe bodily injury. So again, it's not going to be a defense to first-degree murder by saying, well, I didn't intend for them to die. I just intended for them to be seriously injured. That's not going to be enough. Guys, when we look at this element of premeditation, one of the things we tend to see, and we're going to talk about this in a few slides from now, but I just want to point this out. It doesn't have to be something that you plan for any certain amount of time. It can be something that happens almost immediately. you could be standing there and then in 1 second you could decide, I'm going to kill this person, and then do it. And that's going to be enough to satisfy the requirement of premeditation. And again, whenever we see premeditation in like the movies or television, it's always something that was planned out. Somebody decides they're going to kill someone, and then they go like wait in the bushes outside their house and jump them on their way out, or we sort of have that classic scenario of somebody lying in wait for someone else. And while that definitely fulfills the premeditation requirement, it doesn't have to be quite that long. All right, here's my example of homicide. Bert swings a sword at Ernie with the intent to cut off his arm. Ernie then dies of blood loss. In this case, guys, Bert is going to be guilty of first-degree murder, even though he might not have intended for Ernie to die, because he intended to cause severe bodily injury. So in this case, guys, we do have first-degree murder. Even though he can say, I did not intend for him to die, that's not going to be sufficient. And like I mentioned a moment ago, guys, most courts agree that premeditation can occur right before a crime. So Angelina decides, after considering for just a second, to shove her ex-husband Brad in front of an oncoming train, and he dies. Even though Angelina didn't plan this crime ahead of time, she considered it for a second before shoving him. In most courts, they're going to say this is enough. This is premeditation. And when we get into some of the other degrees of homicide, we're going to talk about what happens if something causes you to just snap and go into a rage. That's going to be a little bit different, but we'll get to that and when we get to one of the later elements here. We talked about this a little bit when we did our unit on punishment, and in Pennsylvania, the punishment for homicide, for murder in the first degree, I should say, is the death penalty or life in prison without parole. And even though we don't use the death penalty in Pennsylvania currently, you still can be prosecuted and given a sentence of death. And you can be put on death row, but Pennsylvania is currently not actively executing anyone. That's generally up to the governor to sign orders for execution. So once you are convicted of murder in the first degree, you don't actually have an execution until it's ordered by the governor. And certain governors, including the current governor, will put what's called a moratorium on executions, meaning that you can still be convicted of it, but you won't actually be executed in the state of Pennsylvania. So if you're convicted of murder in the first degree, even though you officially might be on death row, effectively, like what practically ends up happening is that you have life in prison. And that could change in the future. So if you're on death row, just because they're not carrying out executions now doesn't mean they might not change that in 5, 10, 50 years. And depending on how old you are, it is conceivable that you could still be on death row 50 years from now. If you're 20 years old when you're convicted, you could still be 70 years old, and then you could be executed. Second-degree murder is a little bit different. Second-degree murder is the one that a lot of students have trouble with. And second-degree murder is also called felony murder, and this is the easiest way to remember it. When you have a killing that is committed during the course of a felony, while the defendant is engaged in the felony as a principal or accomplice, then you are guilty of felony murder. And there are certain felonies that fulfill this requirement. Arson, kidnapping, robbery, rape, those type of things, assault. If you commit one of those crimes and somebody dies while you are committing that crime, and you are either the principal or the accomplice, and if you don't know the difference, go back and watch the video on that. I posted it earlier. Then you are going to be guilty of murder in the second degree. This is true even if the killing was accidental. So let's say you have two people that decide they're going to rob a bank, person A and person B, and they both agree ahead of time, no one's going to get hurt. And they both take in guns that they believe are unloaded. They're just going to use the guns for threat, right? And they start waving the guns around, and all of a sudden, person A's gun goes off, and it did, in fact, have a bullet in the chamber, right? If it hits someone and that person dies, both person A and person B are going to be guilty of felony murder, even though neither of them really wanted to or intended for someone to die. Let's say person C is out in the getaway car and didn't even know what was happening in the bank during the robbery. Person C, as the accomplice, is also going to be guilty of felony murder. So a lot of times these felony murder charges can be pretty widespread. In some states, you can also be charged with felony murder, even if it was someone who wasn't one of the felons that caused the death. So let's say in our same scenario, person A and person B go into the bank to commit a bank robbery, and a security guard tries to shoot at them, and the security guard misses and hits a teller. All right, the teller dies. Person A and person B might not have even had guns on them. They might have had fake guns, or sticking their finger through their jacket, making it look like they had guns. They're still going to be guilty of felony murder because they are committing robbery. They're attempting to take money through the use of threat or force, threat of force, and someone was killed. So felony murder is really a rule that is created as a deterrent. We do not want people to commit these felonies. So as a result, we're going to make the punishment really, really high. And if someone dies while you're committing this felony, you're going to be on the hook for a pretty serious crime. Guys, this is an example, and this is actually based on a real case. It's very sad. A couple of men broke into an elderly couple's house, and they intended that they would rob them, and they tied them up. From what I understand, they didn't even tie them up very tight, but they were elderly. They were pretty frail. They just assumed that someone would find them within a day or so. The problem was no one did, and the couple died. They both died of starvation and dehydration. So in this case, they committed a robbery. They had no intent that they would die, but their actions led to the death of this couple. So they would be on the hook for felony murder. Here's another example. Brenna and David burned down a pizza shop that competes with their family's Italian restaurant. Unbeknownst to them, the owner of the pizza shop was working late and was in the building, and he died of a fire. They're going to be guilty of felony murder, second-degree murder, because they committed arson, one of the enumerated felonies. Someone died as a result. Even though they had no idea no one was in the building, that won't provide them with a defense. And here's one more example. Shane and Delaney are robbing a pet store. I'm using all my cousins as the names here in case you're wondering who these people are. Delaney is sitting in front of the car, out front in the getaway car. Shane goes inside and demands cash. When the employee moves too slowly, Shane shoots and kills him. Delaney's going to be guilty of second-degree murder, even though she was nowhere near the shooting, even though she wasn't actually in the store, because she is an accomplice. Third-degree murder is really hard to pinpoint in Pennsylvania. A lot of prosecutors use it as more of a catch-all. This is basically all other types of murder, and there are a few that we haven't gone over yet because I'm going to do manslaughter in the next video. It's usually something that's not planned ahead of time. In Pennsylvania, third-degree murder is a separate crime, but some states will actually just roll this into voluntary manslaughter. I don't have a good definition. I don't have a good example of it because, like I said, a lot of times this is just like the prosecution has enough evidence that they can prove a murder, not enough for first degree, right? And again, second degree is really specific. It has to be in the course of a felony. So if they don't have an underlying felony, if the only crime that they have committed was the murder and they don't have enough to show first degree murder, sometimes they'll put third degree in as like the catch-all. Usually the punishment for this in Pennsylvania is 10 to 20 years, so you're not looking at spending quite as much time. All right, guys, I'm going to stop here. Like I said, there is another video that we're going to do that goes with this, and that's going to be on the different types of manslaughter. So you have to really watch both of them to put the whole picture together. But if you have any questions right now, comment below, and I'll answer back with them as best I can. All right, guys, thanks a lot.